As an art teacher, I'm always racing the clock. I want to teach my students content, I want to show them how to use the tools and materials, but most of all, I want to leave them with lots of time for the creative process. This is what attracted me to the idea of flipping my classroom. If my students could learn some of the content at home, rather than in the classroom, then it would buy them a little more time to work on their creative process. In turn, it would also give me more time to work with them individually and help them build their skills in ways that are more specific to them. The question for me was where to begin. I picked up several tips from an article by John Bergman on how to flip your classroom. One of the things he stated was that instead of trying to flip a whole class, you should start with a simple lesson, and that lesson should be one that maybe traditionally your students have struggled a little bit more with. He also stated that I should make sure to include some sort of entry ticket in my video, just to make sure that my students have actually watched it and done the work. Lastly, he suggested trying to keep the video under 10 minutes. I kept all of these suggestions in the forefront of my mind while planning out my first flipped lesson. This is a shot of how demonstrations in my classroom are usually set up. I stand at the back of the room with my demonstration camera, which is actually an iPad, which is then projected on the TV, which students often crowd around. I can keep an eye on the students and also an eye on what's happening in the demonstration at the same time. Unfortunately, the system isn't flawless. It's often difficult to keep everybody's attention on the TV throughout the entire demonstration. When this happens, oftentimes particular parts of the lesson, such as content or maybe a specific skill, can become rather rushed. Keeping everything in mind that I've stated so far, I started my project with 3 main target goals. I decided I would flip my lesson on negative space. The skills taught in this lesson are extremely useful for observational drawing. Yet the way that I have taught this lesson in the past has often been very confusing and has had a very low success rate. This particular lesson on positive and negative space addresses the following 3 standards. In order to create my flip video, I used several different tools. The first tool that I used was simply the camera from my iPad. You can see in this video the actual demonstration for the lesson. Before I flipped this lesson, this demonstration is all that the students would actually be able to see. The second tool that I used was the Explain Everything app. It was the Explain Everything app that allowed me to pull in my demonstration video and use a split screen effect to put the image of what I was actually drawing right next to it. Explain Everything also allowed me to draw on top of those images so that my students could better see exactly what I was looking at while I was demonstrating. The ability to pull in the images, video, and draw on top of the screen is what ultimately made my flipped lesson so successful. The third tool I used was iMovie to edit and put everything together. This is where I could speed up and slow down clips, and also where I did all of my sound editing. Finally, it was all uploaded to YouTube, links were sent out through Gmail to my students, and it was also posted on my blog. Very little introduction was necessary for this lesson. They were simply given a homework assignment just as they would any other homework assignment. The only difference was that this time, instead of going home and drawing, I asked them to go home and watch a video about a drawing. I emailed them a link to my blog post, and I simply told them to pay extra special attention for information regarding an entry ticket into the following class. I was also sure to put the homework assignment on the Google Calendar, just as I would any other homework assignment, only this one contained the link to the blog post so that students were able to access it from multiple venues. It was great to see my students come into the next class and get started on their negative space drawings immediately. They all seemed to know exactly what to do, and when there was a moment of confusion, students were pulling out their iPads to help them before bothering to ask me for help. This was amazing to me because in the past, these lessons had been very difficult for my students to understand, and I had often found myself running around from student to student to help clarify points of the process to them. While the students were working, I walked around and looked at their work. I was extremely excited to see that the level of understanding skyrocketed in comparison to how I had taught the lesson previously. Students were also more engaged in the task because they seemed to have a better understanding of the concepts being taught. I believe this is because I was better able to explain the task and concepts with my visuals in the video better than I would have been able to explain them in real life. The other part that surprised me about the outcome of this lesson was how proud many of my students were of their work. Even though they were simply drawing the negative shapes around the stool, many of the students were so proud that they chose to put their drawings into their digital portfolios. A portfolio that should highlight only the things that they are most proud of. I'm very pleased with my decision to flip this particular lesson. Previous semesters, I've had a much higher percentage of students struggling to understand the concepts being taught, and even less students are able to properly execute the task being asked of them. It was clear that my goal to increase understanding of the concept was met, as well as a major increase of students being able to demonstrate their understanding. I was also hoping that flipping this lesson would allow me more time to help students who were struggling. In previous years, I have not had enough time to help everyone who has needed help. Instead, by flipping this lesson, I found that very few kids needed my help at all, and I had more than enough time to walk around and assess progress while kids worked. As the semester continued, the students demonstrated a much higher level of understanding when it comes to talking about positive and negative spaces, and how to use those spaces in your composition. As you can see in this still life arrangement, the student was able to draw the still life very accurately, and even more so, find the negative spaces and draw those accurately. That's really what this lesson was all about, developing the student's ability to find the negative spaces when drawing from life. I loved flipping this lesson, and I feel that this was a perfect lesson for me to start with. Shortly after flipping this lesson, I flipped a second lesson on penwork value. I wouldn't say that the value lesson was unsuccessful, but it wasn't any more successful than it had been in previous semesters when it wasn't flipped. At the same time, flipping the value lesson didn't present that much of a benefit. I would like to look closely into flipping more lessons for all of my classes, but it is clear that I must consider very closely what lessons I should flip. In doing so, I must establish clear goals and understand why technology would be the better choice for that particular lesson. I would like to once again start with the lessons that I feel are not always easy for students to understand, and carefully consider whether or not the tools I use to flip the lesson will help to improve that understanding. Once my lesson was finished and posted to YouTube, I was able to share it with a great number of people. The course that I was flipping this lesson for is also taught by another teacher in my department. I shared the video with him so that he could use it in any way he chose for his own class. I also shared my lesson in the weekly tech newsletter that goes out to all the different teachers at my school. Sharing it with the school community was wonderful because I received lots of unexpected and positive feedback from all of my colleagues. In the end, there were several takeaways from this project. First and foremost, I'm glad to have another solution to the constant battle of not having enough time in class for my students to work on their projects. I won't be flipping all of my lessons, but I will be flipping some and without hesitation. That leads me to the other big takeaway. I just started to make these videos, and I don't feel they are terribly difficult. Yes, they can be a bit time-consuming, but I'm sure that once I use the tools a little more frequently, then I can begin putting my videos together a little bit faster. I'm confident that using these video tools are going to help me in many, many ways that will go beyond simply flipping a lesson here and there. So did my flipping this lesson meet the definition of redefinition? I'm not really convinced that it did. In the end, my students were still doing the same task and drawing the same stool. That doesn't seem to matter too much to me, though. The reason I say this is that I don't think I really set out to redefine and create a new task for my students. What I really set out to do was to teach a particular concept more effectively. When I look at it that way, I would say I succeeded. I say this because my students can discuss and demonstrate how focusing on negative space can improve a work of art. The ability to see the negative space greatly improves one's observational skills. I feel confident that my students have an understanding, and therefore we were able to move on quickly to more challenging tasks. This, to me, may not be redefinition, but the use of technology to teach this concept was surely a success.